In 2020, there came to Steam a short, graphically crude indie game called Liquidators, which told a fictionalized version of the efforts of three men who ventured into the flooded basement of reactor number 4 at Chernobyl to drain it before the reactor core melted through to it and caused a catastrophic steam explosion that it was thought would have spread radioactive fallout over a vastly larger area than we ended up with. It didn't, but that is what they believed at the time. The player's task is short and simple. The game's sole level is composed of 4 sections containing a valve the player must open, and each section contains some kind of lethal hazard the player must overcome in order to turn the valve. The player can control any of the 3 men, though only one at a time, each of which has a unique gimmick that can make a certain section easier, but ultimately doesn't matter too much. You can complete the game with a single character. None of the obstacles are impossible for any of them to circumvent. The crude graphics are effectively and atmospherically worked around using a pixelation filter that makes everything very grainy. Not just as if you are looking at it through a low quality 80s camera feed, but also as if the feed itself is being affected by radiation. You can turn it off, but I would argue it looks better with it on. It's an extremely short game that admirably tries to give more publicity to the actual trio that performed this feat, but what I'm most interested in discussing about it is its genre, because one glance at the tags for this game on Steam reveals an oddity: horror. It is community opinion that this, a game about turning valves in a wrecked basement, is a horror game. And aesthetically, the game is absolutely going for it. Not just going for it, it's embodying it. Your visibility is limited not just by the lo-fi pixelated graphics, which makes everything look really fuzzy and out of focus and not entirely clear, but also with the lighting being either dim or absent or distressingly colored by the emergency lights, sometimes a sick yellow, sometimes a hellish red, sometimes an eerily sterile white. One section in particular, the area to your right at the start, is nearly pitch black except for the demonic red lights highlighting the valve that lies at the end of that section. Yet that is too dim to effectively pierce the darkness much beyond it. You are reliant entirely on your flashlight to navigate around the intruding corium that is leaked through the ceiling and solidified into a series of stalactites, stalagmites, pillars, and other cave-like deposits all over the 2 rooms and their adjoining hallway that make up the area. You lose health whenever you touch it. Doesn't seem like much of a threat, just step carefully until you reach the final room. The valve lies at the end, bathed in red, but as you enter, your flashlight flickers violently until, unavoidably, the radiation gets too high and it burns out. And you are now stuck in near total darkness. The only thing you can see is the valve, your goal, but it doesn't illuminate any of the masses of corium lying between itself and you. Your only means of detecting them is your Geiger counter, which features directional lights to indicate radiation sources. It is with this proximity detector, not your eyes, that you must navigate the room without bumping into the chromosome melting sludge a lethal number of times. You are quite literally stumbling around in the dark with invisible danger all around you, and if you panic and try to get through it quickly, you will inevitably get yourself killed. You must paradoxically move slowly, very slowly, persisting in this blind and threatened state for much longer than such a small room would normally ever be able to keep you. Your instinct to run from danger that you can't hide from is used against you. The game forces the encounter to draw out, forces you to endure the terror of the situation. The soundscape, too, is classic horror. The entire game, you hear the steady breath of your character, although the effect is almost ephemeral. It's like blending in with the background sounds like an ambient whir. Aside from that, the game is often eerily quiet with only the odd, distant, indiscernible noise, but each section also has its own ambient track to enhance the intended mood. The deep rumbling of the flooding room, the pulsing, deep trill of the corium section, like an ambient, reverberating Geiger counter. The undulating, fluttering, ungodly noises emanating from the elephant's foot, and the airy, echoey, low wail of the final room. The elephant's foot, in addition, also applies a piercing wail whenever you're within line of sight of it, rapidly driving up your rad count and dropping your health bar only a bit slower. The sounds the foot makes are clearly not realistic. Radioactive lava, unimaginably dangerous as it may be, doesn't make such sounds, but they're intended to aesthetically convey the otherwise silent, invisible threat it poses to you in a way that sufficiently unnerves you, makes you want to avoid it, rush out of its sight as quickly as you can. As for the final room, it also adds a light double beat atop the wail to keep the tension up, both of nearing the end and of trying not to make a wrong step. So we have a game that is, in both sound and sight, clearly going for a classically spooky atmosphere, complete with jump scares, bad lighting, ungodly sound effects, and ambiance that is, at best, fraughtly tense, and at worst has you literally stumbling around in the pitch black. Yet I call attention again to where this game is set: the basement of a nuclear reactor, an industrial space replete with a sequence of environmental hazards. We are missing, at least in the conventional sense, the central focus of horror media: the threat, the source of our fright, the object of our concern, the reason we should fear the dark corners and ominous sounds. Not one ghost, demon, or eldritch entity haunts the game, nor does any crazed killer, alien organism, or hulking cryptid stalk the halls. There is, in fact, not a single sentient entity in the entire game apart from the character you currently control and the guy on the radio that speaks to you on a couple occasions. You are utterly alone. The scares, however, as anyone who has played the game should be able to attest, as I've hopefully articulated here, still come and they still work. It shouldn't be a mystery how. There is obviously a threat to contend with. There is something lurking in the dark, or if you get close enough to it, the light. There is something going bump in the night, and it will kill you as surely as a mumbling psycho or a screeching demon would. Or rather, I should say there are two equally represented, if not equally imposing threats. Two antagonists, if you will, one senior, one junior, one primary, one secondary. The secondary threat is the object of your immediate objective, the water. The water must be drained, you are told. But the water, in a sense, fights back. Water is present as the direct obstacle in two of the four sections of the game. One where an awkwardly navigable room begins flooding as soon as you enter it and the door slams behind you, forcing you into a mad dash for the exit. The other, the aforementioned final section in the flooded shaft, requiring you to tiptoe along the pipes without falling in. The contrast between the two sections is stark. Despite sharing an antagonist, the first is a frenzied claustrophobic sequence where you're trapped in a flooding room that cannot be easily navigated due to its angular geometry as lights flash and water rushes in. It's a desperate scramble for the door as the water advances inexorably upwards, squeezing your available air tighter and tighter against the ceiling. It's the fastest paced section of the game, requiring speed that in the Corium section you were immediately punished for, and that your character's laden pace would seem to preclude regardless. You are quite abruptly confronted with an obstacle you likely did not anticipate and are not prepared to deal with, thus, hopefully, producing an expectedly panicked reaction. This is a horror game, after all. That should be exactly what you're looking for. The contrast to the final room should be apparent. There, the water is a passive rather than an active threat. It's not rushing in to swallow you, but merely lapping at your feet, teasing you with its presence as you try to judge which pipe to tread, and ready to plunge you into the depths if you judge wrong. Its visual distortions conceal its depth, creating a wary tension while you remain above the surface, and sheer dread once you take the plunge and see just how far down you can and may very well sink. Fear of drowning is an ancient primal fear, and yet it is rarely ever exploited in actual horror media. Rather, water is either used for thrilling action, as in some kind of disaster movie, which isn't a very common genre these days, or much more commonly as a creepy container for the actual threat. When you combine thalassophobia with how otherworldly and off-putting people often find deep-sea creatures, the deep, dark ocean is a perfect setting for a cat and mouse between your unlucky heroes and some gargantuan ocean monster lurking in the depths, concealed by the mass of water. In these sorts of stories, the water plays the same role as a haunted house or an abandoned asylum, an unsettling environment that heightens senses, creates tension, and thereby makes the threat lurking within it more frightening, and provides some secondary threat in itself. But to have water alone be the threat is unusual. Horrific stories of people drowning are usually the purview of macabre videos on YouTube, more in the category of morbidly interesting than viscerally frightening. First-person video games actually have a unique opportunity to convey the terror of drowning in some pitch-black depth by putting you in the shoes of the drowner, but very rarely is this ever done, and virtually never is it done in an aesthetically frightening way. The closest you might get is Subnautica, but drowning in Subnautica is a very manageable problem, and outside the start of the game is largely replaced by leviathans as that game's source of scares, the PDA's dry voice interrupting the ambiance to tell you that you're about to drown further rounds the edge off. So in Liquidators, thus, we find a novel sort of foe here. Well, one of two. The water is not the overriding threat. It is given quite a bit of screen time, but it is ultimately secondary. The water's threat, and the need to remove it, comes from the greater catastrophic threat eating through the ceiling, the core. The main bulk of the core remains an off-screen menace, eating through the layers beneath the building, inching ever closer to the water it must not touch, a literal weight coming down on us, though relatively slowly. Outlying fingers of the core, however, are present. The most distant, poetically speaking, are the solidified corium formations on the right-hand path from the hub room. I already talked about them as regards the aesthetics of that section, but conceptually these masses of radioactive rock are not just an obstacle in their own right, but an omen about the kind of threat we're facing. Though static and dried up, these piles of indiscernible mass are lethal from so much as a few bumps. If the dried fringes of the molten mass of the reactor core are this deadly and require as much care to avoid as they do, then the core itself must be unimaginably more so. And indeed, while we never see the full mass of the core, thankfully, too, it would be an instantaneous death sentence, we do come across a largish bit of it piling up in a room, the infamous elephant's foot. The foot was not discovered until several months after the disaster, but I can't blame the devs for including it all the same, as its celebrity status practically begs for it. The foot is still molten at this point, glowing brightly, though it is still cooled enough that its light is yellow, not blue, and is positioned as a navigational hazard in the middle of its section, with the player having to move around it to get to a valve without being fried in the process. While the solid corium deposits were only radioactive enough to damage the player on contact, the foot begins rapidly damaging the player after about a second of being within sight of it. It will kill anyone who enters its sight, so to speak. Frictional games tried a couple methods in their earlier games to keep the enemies frightening by discouraging the player from looking at them. In Penumbra, they made it so your idiotic protagonist would panic and get himself caught if he looked at them too long, which felt rather arbitrary and artificial. In Amnesia, they made enemies drain your sanity meter while in view, which hampered your movement when it got too low, but disregarding the hard mode that got patched in years later, ultimately wasn't much of a handicap unless you collapsed in psychosis in the middle of a hallway and an enemy happened to turn down. But as it turns out, they were putting too much thought into it. The foot shows the simplest yet still effective means to keep the monster concealed yet present. Directly punish observation. If you look at the foot, it hurts you. If the foot looks at you, it hurts you. And unless you plan to commit suicide by running right towards it, even when you do expose yourself to it to cross gaps, you'll be looking at where you're going, not at the foot. Mechanically, the game gives the player every reason to never actually get a look at the elephant's foot, thus keeping it a somewhat uncertain threat through the whole section, as you simply can't risk getting a good look at it. It is, at the end of the day, just a radioactive blob of lava, but the fact that looking at it is very literally forbidden allows it to retain the mystery and, by extension, the resulting fear of the unknown shared by any number of shadowy, unseen entities in horror media. The funny thing about the foot and the core in general is that, strictly speaking, it is not unknown whatsoever. Everything it is doing, every property it has, down to the very reason and manner in which it ended up the way it has, is perfectly scientifically explicable. It is neither supernatural nor some kind of natural black box like the unrelatable minds of any number of slasher villains. The mechanism by which it kills you is perfectly understandable, and yet it doesn't feel that way, does it? Regardless of how explicable radiation may be, being killed by merely looking at a glowing rock feels like something supernatural. It feels like something otherworldly, something arcane. Because while a real thing that really exists, it is completely outside the normal experience of almost everyone on Earth. Sequestered as we are in a habitable biosphere smeared across the surface of a middling rock, there are innumerable physical phenomena that we simply do not, and largely cannot, experience firsthand owing to our circumstances. As our scientific understanding has advanced, more and more of these mysterious phenomena have been made manifest in our little world, arguably starting with our ability to generate electricity, but strong radiation of the kind found in a nuclear reactor has, owing to its danger and owing to our being shielded by the magnetosphere, not been normalized the way that electricity or X-rays have. As such, to have its effects intrude upon our safe little bubble is profoundly threatening, not just in an immediate sense, though that is creepy, but on a deeper, universal level as well. Were it not for the magnetosphere, the sun would do the same as the reactor core and disintegrate our DNA, except there would be absolutely no way to escape it. I'd say it's a sort of cosmic horror, but that title is permanently co-opted by Lovecraft's work and that which takes after it, i.e., it is tied to a sort of otherworldliness that is distinctly non-scientific, non-real. By real, I am referring to our actual universe, and sentient. The monster that is high energy radiation and that which produces it, in this case the reactor core, is by contrast scientific, very much real, and completely inanimate. Indeed, while such a threat can very obviously come from space, as with the sun, because it is not inherent to outer space, but is simply the result of a fission reaction, it can, in theory, come from anywhere. It is then not even really a cosmic horror in the way even a black hole is, since it's perfectly possible to create it on Earth. That leads me to the ultimate point of this entire piece. Having demonstrated the kind of monster present in Liquidators, I am left with the uneasy conclusion that, on the one hand, this is very clearly a horror game due to how the threats within the game are presented to us, and on the other hand, these threats are wholly outside the normal classification of horror antagonists, thus making classification of the game within that genre elusive. As I've said, we are dealing with opposition that is totally inanimate, manifested entirely within real physical material and real physical phenomena without any sentient experience, devoid completely of life or mind. The water, and more importantly the core, are the definition of environmental hazards, but I'm not sure the term environmental horror really fits them due to the implicit associations we have with the word environmental, which usually evokes the natural world, the plants and animals within it, and human effects upon all of the above. The term natural horror would have the same problem. Both terms are too caught up in an anthropocentric view of what the natural environment is. That is, that of the surface of the earth and the things that live on it. It has a relatively straightforward, everyday experience sort of connotation. Something like the reactor core is not that. It is a real thing that can and does exist. The way in which it kills people is both real and explicable, but it is wildly outside the normal. Indeed, it requires deliberate human intervention to exist at all. In that sense, it leans on a staple of cosmic horror, wherein humans bring ruin on themselves by delving too deep into something mysterious they can't understand and can't stop. But by contrast to that, the thing being unleashed here is not an indecipherable eldritch entity from another dimension, but a completely decipherable physical phenomenon in the real world. albeit one that is not normally accessible to human experience. That makes it differentiable from the realistic horror of slashers, psychological horror, and any monster movie where the monster is a wild animal. There, horror is generated by relatability, at least in some sense. Even if the deranged serial killer's psychology is unknown or bizarre to the mind of a normal viewer, they're still human, just like them. It is horror that comes from the violation of positive assumptions about humans and human behavior, showing by contrast just how depraved and, importantly, threatening they can be. Psychological horror's relatability is sort of a given, since it deals with human perception and human thought, which the viewer will naturally possess in order to even consume the media in question, being fucked with in some distressing or threatening manner. And the killer sharks and the like, well, they in theory tap into ancient primal fears of predators, of the beastly threats that stalked us when we still chased antelope through the African Rift Valley and that still exist today, largely, RIP saber-tooths. I say in theory because the overwhelming majority of horror that uses wild animals is low budget garbage that is not frightening in the slightest. The water hazard in Liquidators might be closest to something like the shark in Jaws, in that it is a non human but still natural threat, an element of our environment that is common yet has the power to kill us. And it's from prompting that realization in the player the water becomes a horror villain. Even then, the industrial setting, divorced from the ocean or any sort of life, gives it a totally different vibe. And the water's utter passivity, owing to it being, well, water, still puts it in a totally different category than a rampaging shark. But the main villain, the reactor core, is something else entirely. It is, like the water, utterly passive, yet its nature makes it appear, to some degree, as if it were an active threat, given that it can move slowly and it attacks at range. It shares that with natural phenomena like tornadoes and volcanoes, but again, the vibe is totally different because this is not a natural phenomenon in the sense that it is not something that normally happens on Earth. In this case, as I said before, it specifically could not exist without being built and then allowed to melt down by humans. The nature of its danger, radiation, is also radically different. The word I keep coming back to as I ponder it is physical. It's fundamental. It's a product of physics like anything else. But the context of those forces here produces something utterly alien compared to what we normally experience in our little bubble on the Earth's surface. It being so alien, yet still very much real, serves as a spotlight on our normally limited view of the universe and how it operates. The peculiar environment we find ourselves in gives us a drastically warped everyday perception of reality, assuming you're not a physicist, in which case the spell is already broken for you. And the reactor core is a frightening wake up call. Through our own manipulation of reality, we unleash a force that we are normally shielded from, one that is utterly ruinous to us. Yet, being just that, a physical object radiating energy, the ruin it brings is cold. Cold in a similar way to a killer AI, but even more so. Not just unemotional, not just calculating, but mindless. It's not a calculating killer, it is pure calculation. No thought, no intent, just wave functions made manifest. It just is. It has no more mind or drive than a rock or your chair, yet its mere existence is a threat incomparable in degree and sort to anything sentient. It is a microcosm of the utterly passive, uncaring, unanthropic nature of reality itself. The universe can't think, it has no mind, it has no will. Things simply exist within it and interact with each other according to sets of physical laws we understand pretty well, but not completely. If that thing happens to be high energy particles ripping your DNA apart and damning you to an excruciating death, well, that's just the way it is. It can't be any other way. It's part of reality. And no, I don't expect you to find that statement comforting. In fact, the discomfort you might feel from that sort of realization about reality is precisely where the horror of the reactor core comes from. It confronts you with the fact that reality itself is not on your side, or per se, against you, given it has no intent. It simply is the way it is, and it is full of things that can kill you in horrific and bizarre ways, and you can't do anything about it. Because as much as this may lean on the delve too deep trope of cosmic horror, this isn't cosmic, not strictly anyway. After all, the cores of nuclear reactors don't fall from outer space. Well, not on any relevant human time scale anyway. We make them from materials right here on Earth. This isn't a far off sort of villain that lurks in the dark beyond like a Lovecraftian entity. This is much more literally universal. It is everywhere. To keep with our horror theme, you might say it haunts reality. You aren't special. You aren't immune to its effects because you're human. You are fundamentally made of the same building blocks as everything else, so you cannot escape it. It will not spare you. It can't. Inanimate as it is, such a choice cannot be made. This, this is how the core frightens. This is where the horror of liquidators comes from confronting you with an outrageously dangerous object that, in being so different from anything you've ever seen, yet so obviously being real, forces you to confront the existential terror of the uncaring, unthinking, unalterably, inescapably dangerous nature of the universe, of your very reality. No wonder religion is so popular, it lets you pretend none of this is the case. So perhaps existential horror is the right term. It could be. But again, the connotations we've assigned to that word pull it too far from what we're actually dealing with. Existential is caught up in philosophical framing and is rarely, in usual conversation, used to describe one's actual physical existence, or that of any other matter. Interpreted literally, yes, it would work, but people would inevitably assume the label implied something more heady and philosophical rather than physical and tangible. Then again, physical horror has a similar problem in that people are unlikely to think of the laws of physics and the fundamental nature of reality when you say the word physical, because we tend to use it as a synonym for material and oppose it to the immaterial, whether one is talking about energy or some supernatural nonsense like spirit or whatnot. Again, it would be a fine label if read literally. Sadly, I can't think of any other appropriate labels for it. Something like universal horror is even worse in terms of needing to be read literally to fit. So, while I can't guarantee they will be intuitive to everyone, existential and physical are the most appropriate descriptors of this nano genre, and of the two, physical horror better implies the very tangible, fundamental, real nature of it. So that is the label I am going with for now, anyway. I'm open to persuasion otherwise or to different suggestions if anyone has any. The list of entries in this genre is rather short, hence my dubbing it Nano. Beyond Liquidators, the only other example I can think of is, appropriately, HBO's Chernobyl. More specifically, a few select scenes from that show, not the whole thing. It is far more focused on the politics and drama of the event than a pure horror piece would be. But there are a handful of scenes that invoke the same reality-induced dread that Liquidators does. The most obvious, and perhaps the most in-your-face, is the approach to and sighting of the reactor core in Episode 1. The dark and loud corridors our two fated subjects follow leading to the core, accented with emergency lights, invoke suitable dread in advance of the ominous moment when the two slip past the heavy shielding door and enter the reactor. There, they find themselves on a gangway overlooking a wrecked, flaming pit filled with smoke that, no doubt intentionally on the show's part, skews what should be the core's blue glow into a sickly, off-putting yellow, as if to meet the audience halfway in their erroneous but pop culture reinforced expectation that radioactive materials should glow green. For a few brief seconds, we see, for the only time in the entire show, the reactor core. And only for a moment, in a gap in the smoke, do we see it properly, a blinding white glow that sends the doomed duo fleeing as soon as it meets their eyes, an effect reminiscent of meeting Medusa's gaze, though in this case even more horrific, as they will not be petrified but condemned to a gruesome cell-by-cell death. While brief, the eeriness of the core is well framed by the unholy whirring and roaring sounds we're assailed with as it is revealed, the ominous framing of the lighting, the jump scare of sorts when the core is directly visible for a few frames, and the inescapable dread of knowing our two unfortunate heroes have just been Fist of the North Starred without any fanfare. Indeed, owing to the hellmouth imagery and eerie lighting, I can't help but rank this glimpse of the reactor core above the elephant's foot from Liquidators, as the scale and nature of the threat is so vastly higher and even less recognizable. The core is, after all, so bright you can't even make out any of its physical features, only the blinding glow. There are also the scenes with Akimov, Tuptanov, and Ignatenko in the hospital as they slowly suffer that inevitable cell-by-cell death. Tuptanov and especially Ignatenko's scenes lean harder into body horror since we actually see him, while Akimov remains off camera, his condition even more horrific yet never shown, letting the player's imagination take over the task of concocting what he could possibly look like to make the camera shy away from revealing it, given we were shown the other two. The core and its contents are not present, so it's a less direct example, but it does drive home, in ghastly fashion, the bizarre and terrifying consequences of crossing its path. Like being cursed by touching a forbidden artifact, you are doomed, and there is no escaping it, but it still takes time to occur, leaving you to stew and contemplate your demise. I'd say it was cruel were it sentient and thus capable of intent, but it is not. It merely does as it does. Not that that's ever stopped people from anthropomorphizing things. Even if it can't be cruel, its effects feel cruel in a more existential sense, both in that the universe can sign your torturous death warrant without even trying, lacking, indeed, the ability to try, and that this menace was created and unwittingly unleashed upon our little bubble of reality by human action, not outside misfortune. There is also the infamous roof scene, which maintains through cinematography and sound design a fever of dread and anxiety as our intrepid shoveler steps onto the roof to help toss absurdly irradiated rubble over the edge into the still smoking hell pit wherein the monster lurks. As a pitch, making people fear a bunch of rocks on a roof doesn't sound very promising, especially when it's not using the same classic horror aesthetics as the Corium section in Liquidators, but damn, do they pull it off? Already armed with the knowledge of what radiation does to people from prior scenes, especially the early scene of the firefighter getting his hand burned through after picking up a chunk of graphite, as well as the aforementioned hospital scenes, the audience is already prepped to feel anxiety about our focus character being charged with handling the stuff whilst standing amongst even more, and the core still firing lethal rads off right at the ledge he is supposed to be chucking them over. Add in the time limit, and you prime the audience to panic at every misstep. Admittedly, owing to the presentation, the scene leans more towards thriller than horror territory, but that fear it manages to generate towards mere bits of concrete is the part I wanted to highlight. Since I didn't specifically name it nuclear horror, I do intend that my label should be applicable beyond just Chernobyl media. Other out of the norm physical phenomena like outer space, time dilation, and black holes could, presented correctly, work as well. I will say that radiation from a nuclear reactor is an excellent first boogeyman for the genre to use because it hits all the right notes. It's a real thing that exists on Earth right now, but the masses are literally shielded from its danger, making the otherworldly danger it poses feel less concrete and thus more unnerving when actually encountered. Outer space wouldn't be that much harder, since we do send people into space currently. Unfortunately, space is like the ocean, almost always treated as a medium to contain the threat in media, not the threat itself. Time dilation would be much more tricky, since while a real thing, we currently don't have the technology to send anyone far enough from Earth at a fast enough speed or for enough time for it to manifest in a significant and thus disturbing way. Anything that tries to tackle it would have to be sci-fi, thus reducing the immediacy, relatability, and realism needed. Sci-fi horror is obviously a thing, but using it to invoke terror at something real, something that does exist but needs non-existent technology to manifest in a way that's palpable, would be a tricky needle to thread. It may not be well developed at this point, hell, it barely exists as a genre, really, but I hope more physical horror gets made. Not just because it would be novel to see how effectively people could be made to fear inanimate objects and forces, but because the fear it taps into is quite different. As I said, it is more literally existential. It tries to invoke the kind of terror a Lovecraft protagonist feels, but in response to the actual reality we inhabit, not the Lovecraft mythos with all its fabricated eldritch entities and bizarre aliens and interdimensional shenanigans. It makes you fear reality by pulling the wool off your eyes and exposing you to the kinds of horrible things the universe has in store for you that your daily existence makes you ignorant of. It's less detached. It's not the kind of scare you can compartmentalize as fictional, because the whole point of it should be to wake you up to the fact that the monster in question is a real thing that really can do what it's portrayed as able to. Done correctly, this should make its terror, for lack of a better term, stick, lingering in the back of your mind, making you uneasy with the world as it is until you reconcile it mentally. Granted, I'll also concede that actually pulling it off is more difficult. A rock, irradiated as it may be, is less instinctually prone to trigger fear than a poltergeist or a masked killer. We did not evolve to treat glowing rocks as an automatic threat, since obviously such things don't occur naturally on Earth outside of volcanoes. As such, it's usually going to be an uphill battle to make physical horror work. It's all the more credit to Liquidators, then, that I consider them to have succeeded at doing so. How difficult doing the same for phenomena other than nuclear radiation would be remains to be seen. It's hard to make such a judgment when, outside of the examples I've examined here, this entire subgenre remains hypothetical. Further analysis will require more works of this type to be made first. If such things are in the works, I eagerly await them. Until then, this has admittedly largely been a theoretical exercise based on a couple outliers, but I think it was worth articulating that a subgenre has space to be grown here. It doesn't have to be a one-off. But until more examples are produced, this is as far as I can really go with discussing it.